Judith Sloan is also a former productivity commissioner, and another economist, Leith Van Onselen, who used to work at the Australian Treasury and is co-founder of Macro Business. Judith, I'll start with you. What is ruining Melbourne, and is it just Melbourne being ruined?
Thank you very much, and I'm glad to be on with Leith because this is an example, I think, where two sound economists agree. And of course, economists tend to often disagree. But look, it comes down to excessive immigration rates, essentially. So if you look at the growth of Melbourne, as you say, it's grown by 50% over the past 20 years. And that is predominantly due to the migrant intake. So 3/4 of that increase is due to the migrant intake. You get similar figures in Sydney and southeast Queensland, but, there is the force of what economists call chain migration. So migrants go to areas where migrants from the same countries already have settled. So you get this sort of effect of a real sort of crowding in of new migrants. Now, I can speak to you, Andrew, because I know you found Melbourne to be increasingly unlivable, and it's unlivable.
I mean, if you've got, I left it.
Yes,
but Judith, when
and if you're comfortably off, you can kind of get around it.
Oh, yeah, but just leaving my street suddenly went from you could just across the road, and then you had to wait for a couple of minutes for a break in the traffic, and that's in a very short space of time. And Leith, Melbourne, I think, is suffering worse. On your macro business blog, which is excellent, I recommend people look at it, you've shown this graphic of population rises in our big cities. Melbourne is the red line on the top, Sydney the blue just under, and Brisbane the green. And it shows year after year, Melbourne adding another 100,000 people or more, then a huge drop after the pandemic lockdowns, and then a massive rise back after that. Why is Melbourne the fastest growing city, and why do you say it's bad?
Yeah, look, it's the fastest growing city for exactly what Judith Sloan just said. It's excessive immigration. Now, it's worth pointing out that at the 2001 census, Melbourne's population was 3.3 million people, and it took Melbourne about 170 years to get there. But in the last 21 years since then to last year, we've grown by nearly 2 million people. So it's over 50%. And based on the current trajectory, by about the mid-2030s, we're effectively going to add another 3.3 million people from what it was in 2001. So what took us 170 years, we're going to do in about 35 years. And anyone who's lived in Melbourne knows exactly what this means. We've got packed roads, we've got packed public transport. Good luck trying to get a spot in a hospital, a school. And of course, people are paying more for housing, and families are now being forced to live in apartments instead of houses. It's a quality of life destroyer. And unfortunately, our mad premier is actually lobbying the Albanese government to increase immigration even further. He told an Italian language newspaper, Il Globo, last month that he's actively lobbying Anthony Albanese for more immigration. Now, it's the definition of insanity to basically do what's failed over the past 20 years as wrecked living standards, to then go double down even harder and expect a different result. It's the absolute definition of insanity, and it's going to destroy living standards.
But on that point, Judith, I don't get it. Like nationally, 400,000 people poured into Australia in just the past year. Polls show Australians hate this high immigration. They hate, getting so crammed into the big cities, and yet the government keeps doing it. Why is that?
Well, I think Leith is right to point out that it's not being resisted by the states. In Victoria, yes, it's come on down, but some of the other states too. But, as I point out in my column, and I'm sure Leith would agree with me, is that there are, I guess you don't want to use the term rorting, but there are just major holes in the visa programs. So at the moment, for example, there is a visa category which goes back to the pandemic. So it was introduced at that time, to allow people to stay because of the pandemic consequences, right? Now, the pandemic has been over for ages, but what's happening at the moment is that I think in the last quarter, they've issued 66,000 of these pandemic visas. And what's happening is people are working the system. It's very easy to get a student visa. They come in and then the next week they transfer to this pandemic visa. Now, you know, the federal government must know this. If I know this, they know this, and yet they really turn a blind eye because the forces of big Australia are very powerful, and they basically, I think, are prepared to trade off the living standards of ordinary folk.
If you're into real estate, if you're into construction, this is very good for you. If you're a government, more taxpayers means bigger budgets, fix the budget deficit. But the thing is, the goodies have to be spread around more people, and as Leith said, per person, we're actually suffering from this. This is a Ponzi scheme against ordinary Australians. But Leith, I mentioned that graphic. We didn't have it up at the time. We'll show it now, showing how Melbourne is the worst. But the red at the top, but Sydney on the blue, and you see the huge rebound after the pandemic lockdowns. Sydney's blue, so it's not that far behind. Tell us about Sydney. Is that suffering too?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, Sydney has a different topography to Melbourne, so it's obviously got the Blue Mountains, the ocean, etc. So it can't expand as much as Melbourne. Sydney receives about the same immigration as Melbourne. The difference is Sydney loses more people interstate because Sydney's housing costs are so much higher than even Melbourne. And what that basically does is it's like you push on one side of a balloon with immigration, people come in, and then the other side of the balloon bulges out, people spread to Queensland and places like that. So effectively, you know, we've basically got this sort of population replacement program going on in Melbourne where we're bringing in loads of people and Sydney, loads of people from overseas, and it's forcing people out into the regions, into other states, etc. It's just nuts. And that's basically people voting with their feet to get out of these cities because livability's been trashed. But obviously, if you're from a developing country, Australia looks great to them, so they keep coming. But if you're already in Australia, in Melbourne and Sydney, and your living standards are getting crushed, you're going to move elsewhere, and that's basically what's happening.
Well, the reason I'm glad that both of you came on, I really could have had just one of you, but I wanted both. There are no two people who have written more perceptively in recent years about this immigration crisis than the both of you. So I wanted to get you together on this. Judith Sloan, Leith Van Onselen, thank you both so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks.